Good morning and welcome to Church at Home with Rachael for Tuesday, the 15th of March. I do believe in Julius Caesar we were to beware the Ides of March. Anyway, today is a good day and I hope you're having a good one too. Today I'd like to talk about prayer. Yesterday I talked about those disciplines of Lent that we're called to share, of self-examination and penitence. And today I'd like to talk about prayer. I know I've talked about prayer 1,000 times already, well, at least a couple dozen, but you can never talk about prayer too much. Why is prayer so important, especially during such a time as Lent? I think prayer is important because it reminds us that we are not alone. Lent and the lengthening of days and the cold and the sort of the grip that winter has upon us can make us feel quite isolated. And to be quite frank, for the last couple of months or the last couple of years, we have been isolated. We have been dealing with COVID. We have been dealing with the economy and all the ridiculous arguments about stuff. How our government in the last month or two, last couple of months, the shenanigans in Ottawa, and now, of course, this war in Ukraine. This Lent, things seem to have been piling on, and it's a really difficult time. So that's why I think prayer is just so important. Prayer is an opportunity for us to know that we are not alone, because prayer is not a monologue. Prayer is not an actor, standing on a stage, in a monologue, speaking presumably to themselves as they go on and on about something. Prayer is not us speaking to ourselves. That would just be talking to ourselves, which I am an expert at. I do it all the time. I pretend I'm talking to my dog, but you know what? I answer myself too. It's kind of sad. But prayer, by the nature of what it is not a monologue. It is not something we do in isolation. Prayer is a conversation that we have with God, which means we're not alone. And in Lent, we need to know we're not alone. So prayer is this opportunity we have to sit down or to walk or to lay down or do however we pray. I pray when I'm driving all the time. To just have a conversation with God. And sometimes prayer looks like a motor mouth. Like if I'm having a prayer with God in the car, quite often if you're driving by me, you're going to see my lips flapping. They're just like blah, 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 all the time. Keep it going. I have so many things I pray about. I pray about my own life. I'll be honest. I'm quite selfish that way. Pray about my family, my friends, my parishioners, my job, my vocation, my finances, my life, my hopes and dreams for the rest of my life, for retirement, for my sisters and their children, and on and on. I pray a lot, and I pray a lot all the time. A lot, like really, I pray. Yeah, all the time. I figured that prayer is this. I heard this from a priest named Mark Loyal when I was in the Diocese of Huron, still a student. He was, I believe, the priest at Six Nations outside Brantford. And he said to somebody or to our group or something that he thought of prayer as his constant dialogue with God. That throughout his whole day, he was in constant dialogue with God. And just the other day, we were having our Bible study here at St. Thomas, and a conversation came up about, talking and everything. And it was more about, somebody said something really quite profound, that when you're married to someone or you're living with somebody, you don't have conversation all day. Like you don't wake up in the morning and say good morning and then talk all day long. You might be in the same room all day long. You might be in the same house. You might even be in the car together. But there are times of silence. There are times of just companionable silence. It's about being in proximity. And I think in relationship, when we're talking about prayer, I think that's sort of how, that's what the prayer with God is like. That we are having a relationship. We're in proximity with God. And sometimes it's spoken and we're chatting away. And sometimes it's silence. And we're just thinking and being and hanging out. And that can be prayer too. Just being silent, being present, listening and seeing and observing what's around us and seeing God's hand at work. That's prayer as well. And prayer, of course, is also listening. Listening for God speaking to us. Listening for the ways that God is speaking to us through other people or circumstances, that we might hear answers to prayer or questions. this constant dialogue with God, this constant, not just dialogue, the constant proximity with God, I think, is a more appropriate way of thinking about it. That if we are constantly praying, if we are constantly in proximity with God, knowing that God is right there beside us, then when we need to speak, to pray out loud, we can. And when God speaks, we're there to hear, to listen. And sometimes we just need to be present to God as God is present to us. So I think that's sort of how I think of prayer, of how I pray. But like, how can we pray? What are different ways to pray? Okay, if it's dialogue, constant dialogue with God, being in proximity, what other ways are there to pray? So in Lent, we're called to self-examination and penitence, but we're also called to prayer. So yeah, this ongoing dialogue with God, but for some people that's a little too airy-fairy, that's a little too ethereal. Like some people need something a little bit more specific. So prayer can be quite literally picking up a prayer book, opening it up and saying, okay, I'm going to pray this prayer. Let's see here. There's home prayers, parish Thanksgiving, ordinations. They're back here somewhere. I'm going to give you a hint of where you can find some prayers. I use them every day. Okay, so beginning in the Book of Common Prayer, the Book of Alternative Services on page 676, there are a series of collects or prayers. A collect is a prayer that collects your thoughts. So we call it a collect. And there are prayers for the unity of Christians, for people being ordained, for peace, for the Commonwealth, for the Queen, prayer for armed forces, prayer for courts of justice, prayers for leisure, prayers for school educational institutions. There are prayers for all kinds of things, as well as the prayers throughout the book for collects for the week and things like that. All kinds of prayers that you could pick up and use to pray. Book of Common Prayer, awesome resource for prayers as well. Different kind of language. If it's not what you normally go to, I recommend it because it makes you slow down. The language is such, and the words used are not necessarily the words we use every day in our regular vocabulary. So using the words of the prayers of the Book of Common Prayer help us to slow down and pay attention to what we're saying. We might even be called to go and Google up, hey Siri, a question definition. Siri just answered me.
Cuesta means a ridge with a gentle slope, dip on one side and a steep slope, scarp on the other.
Okay, I'm not sure what she just answered, but there you go. So prayer can take the form of actual physical prayers, whether it's your prayer books that we have, or books of prayers. There are lots and lots. You can go to a public library, go to a bookstore, especially Christian bookstores, and you will find volumes and volumes of prayers written by people, by lay people. Prayers written by priests, prayers written in the medieval days, prayers written in the early church, prayers written contemporarily. Lots of people have written prayers. Poetry, reading can be prayer. Picking up something that is beautiful can be an act of prayer. I am surrounded when I record at St. Thomas. We have a paint group that meets a couple of times a week, or used to meet a couple of times a week. I think they're just meeting once a week now for the time being. But their artwork dots the walls of the whole building. And looking, there's a couple of pieces that I gaze at and look at, and the way they're painted, it sort of brings you into the picture. You can imagine yourself walking down a garden path, or sitting beside the water, or standing looking at a barn and the trees. And in that is an act of prayer, because it takes me away from where I am and it puts me someplace. Yes, it's in my imagination, but it makes me think differently. It brings up all kinds of ideas and things that maybe I wouldn't have had if I hadn't stopped to reflect on that painting. And in that creativity, in that willingness to be present to something that's not real, but is so very real at the same time, I think that too is a form of prayer, a way of listening to God and being in God's presence in a different way. Prayer can also take the form of journaling. Lots of people like to jot things down, whether it's a list, simply writing down who you're praying for and what you're praying for. Like Pray for my sisters, Jennifer and Anna, that they'll have a great day and their kids will be respectful and take good care of them in their old age. They're not old yet, but just, this is an example. Praying, if you're a list writer, make your prayer a list. If you like to write poetry, write out your prayers in the form of poems. If you like to journal, if you keep a diary, or if you just want to sit down and put pen to paper, don't worry about having a form. Don't worry about how do I say this correctly. Just start writing and allow yourself to be open to where the Spirit will lead you. It's all form of prayer. There are prayer walks, there's rosaries, there's Anglican rosaries as well, folks. There's all kinds of things you can do. If you want to, you can also Google prayer and ask Siri to help you find out different forms of prayer. But the idea is just to find one that fits you, something that feels comfortable for you, and go with that, and play with it and practice with it. And if it doesn't work, then try something else. But you might be surprised. So as you continue into this Lenten season, working on self-examination and penitence from yesterday and prayer for today, I encourage you to please take time to listen for God's voice and see the different ways that you are called, that God is calling you to enter into a new kind of experience this Lenten journey. Have a great day. God bless you, and I'll see you again tomorrow for Church at Home with Rachael.